so I guess we're getting started. Is that correct? I'm going to guess your slight nod there, Dan, is a yes. Lovely. So welcome everyone to the Blue Division final of the Auckland Novice Tournament. On AF, we have Red Panda with Will Price, Mitchell Palmer, and Ian Chu. And on Neg, we have the Elephants, Grace Baylis, Harper Smith, and Melissa Connolly. So congratulations to all finalists for making it through. So the debate today is, in times of crisis, this House would prefer a technocracy over democracy. I'll ask all speakers to time themselves. I will give you a signal at 8:15 if you do make it to there, but please just keep track of your own time. So without any further ado, I'll invite Will to open the debate for us.
Just confirming there are still POIs, right? Cool. The question at the heart of today's debate is simple. In times of crisis like right now, would you prefer to be in a government led by people like Ashley Bloomfield or a government led by people like
I think it was obviously different. I think in times of crisis, we should defer to the expertise of the experts and listen to what they have to say as the government can say the thing that's better for us. What are we going to do in today's debate? Well, we're going to say that in a democracy in a state of emergency,
we prefer that the government appoints a technocratic government with broad expertise across a wide range of areas. So, for example, we'd have Ashley Bloomfield from Health, we'd have Caroline McLeish from the Secretary of Treasury, we'd have Andrew Costa from Police. We just have a whole range of people who are experts in their fields helping run our government. This would be for a set amount of time or until a certain future state is reached of not crisis. We think their powers would be maximized, but only in relation to the crisis, right? So they can't abolish the legal system, but they can do drastic things in order to change like the coronavirus response. And we also think it could be specific. So like in a national crisis like this, it could be national government, but also like a Christchurch earthquake, for example, they could just take control of the regional government there. We also think Parliament should like inquire into the use of these powers after the fact, so there is some accountability there. There's going to be 4 broad points from our team today. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why it's best aligned with democratic principles to follow a technocratic style of government. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why political incentives hinder crisis management. Thirdly, how we increase public trust and compliance. And fourth, and Mitch will split and talk about civil liberties post-crisis. Firstly, let's talk about why it's better aligned with democratic principles. Democracy isn't sacrosanct because it says democratic elected leaders have a right to be in charge at all times. They don't say that people we vote for should be making all the decisions. We see this in a number of cases already, right? So many countries have constitutions that restrain the limits of democracy. So when Americans refer to the First Amendment, that's something that prevents the democracy from exercising full democratic power. Secondly, that like ministers already delegate all the time. Not only do they have like advisors, but like the police and the treasury exist, and we acknowledge that they have better scope to fix their certain areas. So what that means is we already recognize in some cases, it's not like sacrosanct that democracy should be enforced. Importantly, democracy is about enforcing worldviews that people broadly agree with, not the nitty-gritty of policy. And in times of crisis, the objective is like the same in consensus from the large majority of society. Everybody wants the crisis solved quickly and effectively, or at least a huge majority of people do, right? So what we think at the end of this point means is whichever side solves the crisis most effectively is also the most democratic, because it's also enforcing the broad scope of what like democratic ideals would want to achieve in this situation. Second point there, why political incentives hinder crisis management. Four reasons why this is the case. The first is that we don't contest that politicians are at least somewhat publicly interested, like care about us, right? But we think they also have a significant secondary motive of political success, right? Which means they always are thinking about what might be bad for them long-term, what would get in terrible approval ratings. Note also that what is popular is not always good. Why is this? because recognize that the public doesn't have full information at any given time. Like there's no way that everyone in society could have the same information as the expert, like epidemiologist, right? And even if the ministers do have perfect information, they know that those who are judging them based on their actions don't. So their decision is based on how that decision would be evaluated if you didn't have perfect information. So this is how we see things like Trump tweeting "liberate" like against the states' lockdowns because he knows that that will get him political capital, even though it's something that's like blatantly bad for those states and blatantly bad for the politics of public compliance there. Secondly, politicians have limited attention spans and a variety of objectives, right? So a politician always has to be thinking about, yes, the crisis, but also the election and like what their donors might want. So even if they like 100% wanted to make the best decision and didn't care about electability, they have to listen to voices that aren't experts. So by this, I mean things like business lobbying, which like lobbies for like a lockdown to be lifted, which is objectively a worse policy in many cases, but the government's likely to listen because they're like tied by the strings to those people. Thirdly, about quality of implementation. So this is yeah, I'll tell you now.
Why is not the biggest characteristic for whether politicians get re-voted, whether they succeed in dealing with the crisis and actually fix people's lives?
Right, because people are very short-termist, right? So people right now are gonna like get angry because Jacinda isn't lifting the lockdown and they want to go out because people don't have perfect information, which I told you before, right? And so maybe like right down the line in years in the future, people can evaluate, oh, maybe that was the right decision. But right now and like in the near future when they're likely to vote, they're not going to be listening to those things and they want to like get angry at the government. Third mechanism here about the quality of implementation. So even if we accept that these politicians are going to make the right decisions, we think it's just worse to have an intermediary between the PhD knowledge to the generalist politician knowledge. Why is this? Well, firstly, because most ministers like didn't study that thing. They studied something like political science. That's not their expertise. Secondly, even if they did, MPs aren't picked for a certain portfolio for their expertise. They're picked for like bargaining chips and party politics. That's how you get people like David Clark and Phil Twyford staying in power in like areas that they have no expertise. Thirdly, they just don't have enough time to become experts. You only have 3 or a max 5-year terms, and also they have reshuffles within those terms. So that means like the quality of implementation is going to be poorer because they're less good at doing it. Fourthly, we just think it's going to be slower crisis management, right? Experts are likely to agree with each other more because they all know the basic facts and they all agree on the broad consensus of scientific knowledge. And they also don't have to do like the dumb ritual of parliament debate, and they don't have to like debate as if they're in the public eye, which politicians often do. What this means at the end of this point is when the difference is life and death, we think it's vital that you have better management to make the right decisions and make them faster, which only comes when you have a technocratic government. Thirdly, from me, about public trust and compliance. 2 things to recognize here. Firstly, that politicians are always in the public square, which means they have to build personas that are necessarily partisan and importantly confrontational in order to stay relevant, in order to stay like newsworthy and in the media. So they're always looking to like be the person who's willing to say that like thing that is going to be edgy and get people riled up, right? Which means always people are like distrustful of politicians, right? That's why they have like one of the lowest ratings of trust in careers, except for like car salesmen. But secondly, like 50% of the country or up to 50% of the country like disagrees with their platform, doesn't even want them in power in the first place. So you're really unlikely to listen to a politician like that like just doesn't believe in anything you believe in and you just want them out of power. Compare this to someone like Ashley Bloomfield, right? People know he has no self-interest in lying to the public. So people are easy to trust him, even though they've never seen him before. We've seen massive trust in figures like this. Ultimately, what this means is better compliance with things like lockdowns, which is vital, especially in crises related to public health. Proud to affirm.
Lovely, thanks Lauren for your speech. I also just quickly introduce the panel for tonight. We've got myself, Daniel Meyer-Gant and Joe here, if anyone was wondering. Next we'll have Grace from the Elephants to be introducing their negative case.
It'll actually be Harper.
It will be Harper. Are you speaking second, Grace?
Melissa.
Melissa?
Yeah, and Harper does the reply.
Sorry, who? So there is everyone in your team: Harper, Melissa, and Grace.
Yep, that's the correct order.
Harper, Melissa, Grace. Okay, my apologies there. So we'll be inviting Harper to open the negating case for us.
In times of crisis, people want to feel as though they have some control in the decisions that are being made. This is enabled when we allow democratically elected governments to operate as they were elected to do and represent their people. What do we support in today's debate? We broadly support the response plan of New Zealand, right? Having technocrats advising on policies, people like David Bloomingfield, like they do in literally every situation when they make decisions. But we would have politicians fronting the cause, making the decisions like they are in New Zealand. We think that there are acts in place to limit the powers that politicians have in these times. We think that they are there to give them guidelines. For example, we think that the Health Act means that the government has existing framework to work within, and we think that those plans are made cross-party, and so broadly most people can agree with it. For the affirmative team to win today, we think that they have to prove both that they get efficient, effective decision-making by technocrats, and secondly, that the public will buy in. My 2 points in today's debate is why we get better decision-making under our side of the house, why we get more public buy-in, and why we win. Melissa is going to split and tell you about how we have better accountability mechanisms on our side of the house. My rebuttal is going to be integrated. I'll flag when I'm doing that. So on to this first point, decision-making. We think that we achieved decision-making in a number of, better decision-making in a number of different ways in today's debate. Firstly, we think that democratic governments have arranged coalitions and they have government structures that they have already organized, that they have worked under for their term, so they know what to negotiate on. Comparatively, we tell you that technocrats don't have a clear structure to facilitate negotiations in the same way. We don't think that they're as adept at negotiating as politicians are. And we also just neglect what so we push back against what Will said about technocrats broadly agreeing. We think that there's a massive spectrum of ideas even within something like epidemiology on how to handle this, and we think that they just aren't necessarily going to agree, right? Because the nature of technocrats is that they do have black and white thinking because they have high levels of expertise in one specific area. We think that crises actually span across multiple different areas and a wide range of disciplines.
Point.
I think that because technocrats probably all think that their one discipline is really important, or is the most important consideration to be made, or is at least a very significant consideration to be made. We think that negotiations can be especially stifled. Like if we look at the coronavirus response, it's actually not just health and epidemiologists that we need responding. We need people responding in economic ways. We need people taking into account how people are feeling at this time of crisis. And we think that technocrats with their highly specialized, individualized sort of thing in one particular area might not be able to weigh those same concerns across a variety of different things, as well as politicians do. In terms of them not agreeing with each other, we think that the wide range of views and the fact that there are going to be disputes is actually also something that could heavily decrease public confidence. When you're told that someone is a perfect expert in the area and that they know exactly what they should be doing and they're definitely going to be right, when they do disagree, we think that lowers public confidence. I'm going to talk to you more about that in my second point. Secondly, we tell you that technocrats aren't perfect either. We think it's impractical to think that technocrats have all of the answers in these areas. If we look at the World Health Organization, they didn't have an effective crisis management strategy, and they weren't able to take actions, yet they're supposed to be the health response team, and this is literally their area that they're supposed to help in, right? And we think that the technocrats just aren't as adept at making judgment calls as you might think they are. I'll take whoever said point.
So what part of the WHO crisis management strategy was for?
I think just the fact that there was such a delayed response in getting accurate information out there, the lack of a full pandemic plan, and the lack of being able to advise individual governments. Like for a long time, we were told, oh, it's nothing to worry about, all that sort of thing. And then suddenly there was a massive shift when we found out, oh no, there actually is something to worry about. Like we shouldn't just take this lightly. Thirdly, we tell you that governments under our side of the house are able to use information from technocrats. We tell you that information isn't mutually exclusive, like I flagged to you in our model, right? Ashley Bloomingfield does advise Jacinda Ardern, and she's likely to take that on. We think that, like, in terms of what Will told us about the political success motivator, we think that means that they're actually more likely to buy into the advice from experts because they want to make good decisions. In terms of them being like short-term thinkers, we think sure, that's one part of their job, but we also think that their job is very comparative also. People can see Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand having far fewer cases and far fewer deaths when they take on technical advice compared to a different country like America. We think that voters operate in a comparative way as well as a short-term way. We think that people, politicians, don't need to be experts in certain areas, but they do need to be experts in taking on lots of information and weighing that information. They need to be experts in writing policy. They need to be experts in negotiating, and they need to be experts in calming the masses of people who are probably also freaking out in this time of crisis. We think technocrats just aren't that, and that's something that politicians are able to do. Second point, why we get better public engagement and public support on our side of the house. Why is this a really important point in today's debate? We think that policies don't matter if no one sticks to them, right? The coronavirus response policy in terms of stay at home, isn't going to matter at all if no one sticks to it. When we look at the United States, where there's low public buy-in to both their individual state policies and the federal response, we think that means that people, where people don't stay home, that's actually extremely detrimental to the crisis. Why do people buy into governments more? We tell you firstly, these are the people that they voted for, the people that they know. The majority of people probably trust them, or at least has some semblance that the people that they did vote for are in Parliament holding them to account, for example, national voters or that sort of stuff. It's even better when voters in opposition, when politicians in opposition are able to unite with majority governments. We think that just increases public trust and public buy-in. We tell you also, because the powers are distributed relative to the vote, we think that people basically the majority of people buy into them in that way. We think compared to technocrats that they didn't vote for, they would far prefer and trust the politicians they did vote for. Secondly, we tell you that politicians have practical experience convincing people, right? They have charisma. Or if technocrats, we tell you also that if technocrats do fail, people lose any semblance of faith for them at all, like they did the World Health Organization, because they are supposed to be seen as the authority on that topic, like I told you earlier in my speech. The democratic governments that have best responded to this crisis were moderate governments, were governments which might not be moderate but have significant public buy-in. And that's because the majority of the public can get behind their policies, and that way their policies are carried out to the maximum effect. At the end of this debate, we tell you that governments are far better at both addressing the policy needs that exist in a wide range of spectrums, but also in mitigating the public fear that exists and getting public buy-in. Very proud to oppose.
Lovely, thanks Harper. I'll now invite Mitchell to continue the affirmative case for us.
Side opposition in today's debate has way too much faith in politicians. They tell us that they are experts at weighing up alternative value judgments, that they can decide between different types of advice, and that they will be the best people to make the necessarily subjective decisions when it comes to deciding what to do in a given crisis. We just don't think that was ever true in today's debate. And we tell you that although politicians broadly operate in a helpful way by bringing the worldview of their voters to the top of government and using that to broadly change policy and broadly operate, we think that like, and they are good at debating on the broad strokes of policy, we think that the vast majority of actual like technocratic, actual detailed policy work is done by technocrats in both worlds. And it is but the problem is when politicians are given the option to ignore it. And secondly, the problem is when even if they don't ignore it, there exists a layer of translation between them, which means the advice they are getting is not necessarily the advice that they implement. Two things so far in the debate. Firstly, quality of the response. Secondly, how do constituents feel? Then I'm going to extend by talking about why our policy is better for civil liberties. Let's deal firstly with the quality of the response. Like the first layer here that we heard was that, well, technocrats can be wrong too, but that's just like symmetrical, right? And so like facts can be wrong on both sides of the house. The fact is that in a world where politicians are in charge, we say they are less able to evaluate when those facts are right and or wrong. They do not understand the difference between like a randomized control trial and an observational study. Like they are just in matters of this, right, in epidemiology or in earthquake recovery or in nuclear disaster recovery, they are not the experts, and it is less likely that they will be factually wrong or less likely that they will have a factual misunderstanding, even if experts try to stop them. So, but let's take side opposition at their best, which was that, and this was where they told us that not all of the decisions that are being made in these lockdowns are necessarily technical, that at some level there are value judgments, and that it is better that we let democratic institutions decide that. Firstly, let's respond by saying we didn't think it was true that we were going to be willing, that we were proposing that like one profession should be able to monopolize all of the advice, all of the government, right? Like we literally modeled in that we wouldn't just have Ashley Bloomfield as the benevolent dictator for the next few weeks. But secondly, we say that like these value trade-offs, right? These are not necessarily all that complicated to make. The first thing to say is like politicians probably don't understand what the people want at a significantly more high level, at a significantly higher level than technocrats. Why is that? Because basically everyone is essentially just operating on gut reckons, right? There may be some polling, but that can happen in both worlds. Both sides of the house are essentially applying their subjective value judgment. And what we tell you is that because like it might sound like in that world you should prefer the democratically elected people to do that, but we don't think that that's true insofar as democratically elected people are elected to govern principally in normal times, right? They're elected based on their thoughts and their value judgments, you know, when, you know, should we have more growth or a bit more equity, you know, sort of basic considerations that voters consider. We don't think that voters all that often when they're at the voting booth are like, how would this person react to whether we should whether we should lock down the economy and save 5 lives, or whether we should keep it running and save 5% of GDP. We don't think that's something that faces voters at the polling booth. What we then tell you, therefore, is that like politicians have just as much right to make these judgment calls as technocrats. We don't think that anything special about them means that they have a particular right to do it. Secondly, we tell you that even if we are like weighing up two different classes of outcomes, like there's we have a system for that, right? Like the policy analysis is all about weighing up classes of outcomes, right? That's how the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Transport works out the benefit cost ratio for like a road, right? They work out how many lives are we going to save. They value them at $4.5 million a life, and then they work out how much it's going to cost. Like we don't think it's all that unusual, and we don't think that technocrats are that unfamiliar with making multiple category trade-offs. Finally, let's just like put the nail in the coffin here. Like it was never true that like that there was going to be much distinction between the experts and the politicians on this question where the politicians would have made the right decision, right? Insofar as the general national mood was probably quite obvious when the state of emergency was declared, politicians have as much access to that as normal people. Right. What we say at the end of this point, no, thank you. Like, so firstly, like, let's be clear, like, they didn't respond in any detail to the material we heard from Will about the fundamental failings of politicians as decision makers in this world. But what they did tell us was that, oh, elections will hold them accountable, they'll do the best thing. But that just like wasn't necessarily true for a couple reasons. Firstly, like, elections probably, like, voters don't know what the options were, right? Like, even if a politician made a bad call, voters don't know what the counterfactual world looks like. And we say that, like, it's unlikely that voters will be able to actually make that judgment. But secondly, so we think that undermines a lot of the democratic accountability material. But secondly, we just don't think they at any point dealt with our material about why putting a level of intermediary, a requirement for translation, makes the decision-making worse. Now let's talk about the feelings of constituents. Like, what they tell us is that constituents are just going to feel more reassured by politicians. I just don't buy that in any world. Like, at what point, sorry, like, I don't mean to be rude here, but in what world is it more reassuring to have a person with a Bachelor of Communication Studies from Waikato University telling you what to do in the coronavirus than it is to have a person who is a public health expert who literally worked at the highest level of public health, who has studied it? Like, I don't think that in any world, just because we voted for them means we like them, like, it just means that, like, we trust them in this situation anymore. They're going to have to do a bit more to flesh that out. But secondly, we just know that they didn't respond to our material about half the country disliking them. Like, as much as it were to say, oh, a majority like them, that's good enough. Majority compliance isn't good enough, like, particularly in this circumstance. If 45% of the country voted for National, if that 45% dislike the government and therefore don't trust their advice, that's bad. We say it's much more likely they will trust constituents. Finally, in terms of civil liberties, 3 ways that this works. Firstly, why we get better civil liberties. Firstly, like, the rules are going to disappear after the technocrats go out of power, so that creates a clear dividing line, which will mean that the life will go back to normal. Secondly, the transition of systems between technocratic and democratic government makes it clear in the voters' minds that the crisis is over, which means that they are more likely to hold the government accountable for civil liberties. And thirdly, we just think that, like, politicians, if they no longer govern in crises, won't get used to crisis level powers. Like, and this may sound like totally abstract in New Zealand, but remember that the entire, like, the waterfront strike was crushed using World War II era powers. The entire command economy of New Zealand was crushed using World War II era powers. Like, this is a fundamentally important point in today's debate. So even if you don't buy any of our other material, note that it is much more likely we will return to full democracy if politicians aren't allowed to get used to crisis level powers.
Lovely, thank you, Mitchell. I'll now invite Melissa to continue the case for the negating team.
Oh, can everyone hear me? Awesome. The point that Mitch never grappled with in this debate is the point that you don't need to be an expert to be a politician. Like, on both sides of the house, you get the same outcomes in terms of policy, right? Like, there are still technocrats informing Jacinda Ardern when she's telling you about levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. But the difference is you're buying into what Jacinda is saying because you just have absolute faith in her because you elected her, or you had the hand, like, or some part of hand in her decision making. Like, that's the most important part in this debate. You can only get the ability to solve this crisis if you're able to get people to buy into the response from the government. You can only get that through intermediaries. That's their role in this debate, and that's why we win. Okay, 3 issues in this debate. Firstly, which body gets more public buy-in? Secondly, which body is best able to serve the people? And finally, I'll split and bring you a point about the benefits of democratic governments being accountable to the public. Okay, First point, which body gets more public buy-in? Look, this is the most important policy in this debate. It doesn't matter which side gets better policy because they're going to be the same. Technocrats play a pretty important role in either side. Ashley Bloomfield is going to be in this debate no matter what. What we say is we'd rather have Jacinda up there with him being able to give people that little bit of an intermediate explainer and bringing it back down to the everyday person. That's the point of members of parliament. They're elected by the people to represent their people. Ashley Bloomfield, with his doctorate degree, simply isn't the majority of the population. Okay, I've already explained how we get the most technical input. What did they respond to this with?
What information?
They only really engaged with this in the best case scenario, right? For their side of the house. They only explained how this works in countries where they have bad politicians, like the UK, where you have politicians not acting within the interests of the people, like the US, who are incredibly partisan, right? But we believe that this debate equally takes place in New Zealand, where you have people incredibly proud of the politicians who are making decisions, where you have parties uniting and taking a common front in order for the message to be sent clearly.
Information.
Yes.
Even in New Zealand, there's a whole lot of national voters who are currently really displeased with the government because they were always going to be, because they didn't vote for them and won't respect their decisions because they didn't want them in power. And it's even worse in the US when you've got Trump actively saying things that his medical advisors aren't telling him to do. At what point is your situation where Ashley Bloomfield's just the intermediary, the true thing for all cases?
Okay, look, we think that Ashley Bloomfield is the rare case of an academic being able to communicate with the general public, right? It looks like technocrats using a ridiculous amount of jargon and things that not everyday people don't understand. And that makes us more fearful, more confused. What do politicians do? Look, America is going to be just absolutely screwed in either scenario in this debate because they get partisan technocrats and politicians. They're just incredibly screwed either way. What we're saying is that Jacinda is vital in this crisis because she's explaining to people in everyday words why we need to stay home and why it's important for us to translate the message and listen to the officials and why making these policies. On the point of opposition MPs and national supporters being angry, I'll address this in my next point of clash, but when you see things like Simon Bridges taking the back seat and being pretty silent and generally accepting what Jacinda is saying, that's when you get national voters being more willing to buy into what she's saying, right? You get the opposition still being represented and still being informed on the same issues that the government is. They just in the same conversation, and everyone needs to be on the same page. Okay, what's the comparative? What have they talked about in this debate? Will talked about technocrats being better equipped because they don't have partisan influence. Look, I've just flagged this. Firstly, they definitely are partisan in the USA. Whoever gets put forward is going to be pretty politically contentious, right? When the Republicans are in power, they're going to be listening to Republican scientists' advice that might be heavily swayed by some kind of influence in the Rust Belt, something like that. That's not going to give the fair, unbiased, non-partisan view, right? You're still going to have the same harms that occurs under our side of the house. And even if there isn't partisan technocrats in this debate, they cannot negotiate with each other effectively and consider all other views because they don't have the same agreements that governments do. They don't have the same abilities to get in a debating chamber and look beyond their own views because they have so much education in their own party.
On that point,
people to act as the intermediary between each piece of expert advice that they're being given is a parliament that has been elected by New Zealand or by whatever country to represent them. Okay. Further, we heard from Team F a lot in this debate that the intermediary responses are bad. Okay, firstly, intermediary responses are exactly what we need in crisis. We need someone to package information nicely so we know what to do and we know how to fix the crisis in layman's terms. Secondly, even if we engage with bad politicians, firstly, they're accountable and likely to get rolled. It looks like politicians being demoted. It looks like them, and the health minister in the UK just being axed from like his position. And secondly, if they're not rolled by their own party, they're going to be voted out at the next election because people don't remember that short term. Like if they think the response to coronavirus was so bad, they're not going to vote someone back in again because this is a pretty big issue. Okay, second point, which is very brief. Which body is best able to serve the people? We heard some material from Will about democratic principles, but I'm quickly going to brush over this because I cover it in my split anyway. Okay, the government can act in ways like demoting MPs to get rid of people if they don't think that they're serving the right purpose, or they can just get voted out at the next election. And I've already addressed everything else from the POI. Okay, great. Moving on to my split. The benefits of democratic governments being accountable to the public. When governments make decisions regarding a response to the pandemic, they are forced to evaluate what impacts each option has on the groups and on every group in the country, and factor in things like fiscal responses into the health response. It looks like, firstly, in the short term, public pressure means poorly performing ministers are stripped of responsibility. It looks like David Clark being very actively condemned for all of his stupid actions, considering like not following lockdown rules. It looks like the health minister in the UK being demoted because he can't perform his role correctly. Technocrats don't have this degree of accountability in the short term. If Ashley Bloomfield says something that we don't agree with, we literally cannot do anything about it because we didn't appoint him in the first place, and we don't have an ability to get rid of him if he does badly. Secondly, in the long term, if the government overall performs poorly, people can hold them accountable at the next election. Like, look, in times of crisis, government approval ratings usually go up, but Donald Trump is doing such a bad job that he's not even getting a few percentage out of this. Like, people aren't going to vote him back in, and it's just not going to look like the same government after this crisis. Technocrats don't have the same accountability. If as a body, they are really badly responding to this or not giving the advice that people look for, then they're not going to have the same degree of accountability. When this crisis finishes, they're going to look exactly the same. Because we enable accountability and this intermediary response, that means that people actually buy in and stay home. That's when we save lives, and that's when we win this debate.
Lovely, thank you very much, Harper. I'll now invite Ian to close the substantive portion of the affirmative case for us.
Cool. I'll just tell my sister to be quiet because they were a bit loud out in the hallway. So I'll be like 5 seconds.
For everyone's potential interest, Ian has a small baby sister who's very cute.
Yeah, my flatmate's being very loud. He types just extremely loud. We charging?
He looks very small. He looks like a very small man.
I think that's Jesus, Emma. All right.
It was ridiculous of Melissa to come up here and base her entire speech around the idea of partisan technocrats. When we take, for example, the director of NIAID in America, Anthony Fauci, who has served in his role for 20 years under like 4 different administrations, under President Trump at the moment, President Obama, Bush, and Clinton. We think like it's just ridiculous that they base like such a significant part of their case on this idea of like technocrats being partisans and the lack of politicization around technocrats simply does not exist in the real world. All right, panel, 3 main points of clash for you in today's debate then. So first of all is under which side of the house do we get more effective response to a crisis? Secondly, about the in terms of the policy itself. Secondly, about the implementation of this policy and compliance around it. And then thirdly, about the future ramifications of the crisis going forward after the crisis has subsided. So first off then, on the effectiveness of the response then in terms of like the policies that's actually written. And note here that we've maintained a consistent line through we've maintained a consistent line that the policy that will be implemented and like decided on by ministers will be subpar for a number of reasons, right? We've told you about the fact that they've like got to think that they've got like political considerations to take in mind in terms of like electability and like, you know, the future of future electorate success. We've also told you about the fact that like, they've got like to think about, they've got to consider other stakeholders, right? In terms of like donors or interest groups or other such things, right? And like so at first, NEG tried to like had a gotcha moment when they said, but what about the WHO? They were supposed to be like a, you know, neutral technocratic group who has failed in the response, right? And we say that like the reason that the WHO has failed in the response is exactly because of the sort of political considerations that ministers would have to like bear in mind anyway, right? Because the reason the WHO wasn't able to have an effective response was because like a number of the officials sort of had were beholden to like the Chinese government, right? We saw like countless times, you know, they appease the Chinese government, and we think that's actually the reason why it led to such an ineffective response to the coronavirus, right? And we think that those same political considerations will also come into play when ministers are in charge, because of these political considerations they have to make in the moment. So like therefore the main sort of benefit that NEG tried to push here was about how ministers are able to like do value judgments, and that's why they're good. And here I think Mitch pretty effectively deconstructed that response here. So we told you about how like there probably isn't that hard different from like making value judgments in normal times, right? But we also tell you here that not only past value judgments, they also have to make value judgments about like the different facts that are presented to them, the evidence and the trends that they are, and the data they're presented with, right? And so like, I'm gonna ask you a question, right? Like, who do you think is better suited to make decisions for a country? Do you think it's David Clark, who has a PhD in theology? Is he better equipped to like interpret and to put together all the different pieces of evidence in front of him? Or do you think it's like an actual technocrat, right? Like someone who has spent like a lot of time in the field and who has lived their whole lives in this field, right? We think that sort of experience is invaluable and something you just don't get with a minister, right? They spend their entire time working with that. They're clearer conception of like what's going on and how all the different pieces like interact and work together. Moreover, we also gave you multiple ways. Of like how this also plays out, right? I talked about like the intermediary effect, where like potential like expert advice is lost in translation because it has to go through many different intermediaries to get to the actual minister for them to be able to formulate the policy. So we think that you lose a degree of clarity in terms of like how that influences and impacts on the decisions being made. Yes, and then lastly, in terms of the accountability. So here we say that like again, like there's no counterfactual to like for the public to compare to. So we don't think that like there's any like less accountable in a technocracy. I'll take a point of information if you have one now.
Can you please explain why people need to be experts to write decent policy or to pass decent policy?
Right, so like we think it's still reasonable to have like civil servants, like policy writers in place to broadly translate like policy objectives into like actual policy, right? We think that like ministers themselves probably aren't that involved with running actual policy, right? They delegate that role to like civil servants within the actual department, within the actual ministry. We think that's like we think that that's where like the primary value of a minister comes from. All right, so the second point of flash about implementation then. So first of all, let's talk about buy-in, because this is where like the NEG team try to like push a lot of ground, right? So first of all, they told us that like because people are familiar with politicians, they'll be more inclined to trust them, right? And we just simply never brought this like down the line. We don't think they ever did enough to like explain to us, right? Because like all our material here about the fact that like 60% of the country never voted for them means that they like never fundamentally agreed with the platform that they were voted on, right? But we think that like even if like approval ratings go up, we think the fact they didn't vote for them just means implicitly they probably aren't going to trust them as much, right? So we don't think that you're going to trust politicians even much more than sort of a technocrat who was like completely neutral and and you don't think he's like out there, he's got like a secondary motive or some reason to lie to you, right? And then they try to push this benefit about how like politicians are able to like convince people, able to talk to people, about to like use rhetoric, right? And like our response to this is like we can get that under our side of the house as well, right? Because like recognize here that like science communicators are a thing, right? You can go to Otago and get a degree in science communication, or we can go to like AET and get a communication comms. And we think we can have professional technocrats in the role of like science communicators specifically to convey this information to the public, or you can have like professional, it's just like communicators in general, right? Who are able to convey what the government and what the technocracy is doing to help alleviate the problems here. So we think that actually when we get like these qualified people, who have actually studied there and worked in these industries, we think that they are far better equipped to like bring in better buy-in for the public than the Labour government, which only gain a plurality of votes within the last election. Moreover, we also told you about the fact that there's a sort of lag in terms of like the response time here, right? There's a reduction in speed under democracies, but first of all, because of like partisanship, right, between parties, like slowing down progress, but also because of the ritual of debate and like having to appear to like go through procedures you would normally have to in a democracy. So for these reasons, the implementation, you get worse buy-off and you get slower response, which is crucial in a crisis. Then lastly, last point of clash about the future of the government after the crisis. So Mitch gave you a whole lot of material here about how civil liberties are less likely to be eroded in the future once we exit out of technocracy, because the fact that there's a clear transition period, so people know exactly, so that that isn't vague about when does the crisis end, when does it start, it ends when the technocracy officials step down, and so like people are more willing to demand their civil liberties back. But we also say that there's potential for ministers to abuse their power once crisis has ended. So the end of today's debate, then, we're the team that shows you why we get far better policy without like being distracted by other considerations that are secondary, why our implementation of this policy is faster and we get far more buy-in, and why we will have like the future of government will be significantly better. We have won today's debate.
Great, thank you, Ian. I'll now invite Grace to close the general substantive portion of the debate for us.
We heard some new substantive material from the third affirmative speaker, which is that, people can get degrees in science communications and they'll get the exact same level of public buy-in on their side of the house. But the reality is people aren't in love like frothing Susie Wiles, right? The response has been, we love Daddy Bloomfield and Auntie Jacinda. Bloomfield gets his validity, gets his public trust, gets his authority from the fact he stands on the stage with Jacinda and he presents something which we really are grateful for, which is a democracy that can cooperate with experts. That kind of scenario is one that people are more likely to buy into, more likely to believe in than random technocrats who you've never seen before trying to tell you how the crisis works, right? We think that it is a unique benefit in our side of the house, and that's how we win today's debate. In my speech, I'll do a few things. Firstly, I'll look at public buy-in and which side of the house achieves that. Secondly, I'll look at decision-making. And then thirdly, I'll look at accountability sort of as a mechanism to that decision-making. So firstly, on public buy-in, essentially what we told you was that you voted for these people and you recognize them and you trust them when they make decisions on your behalf. A big response from the affirmative team was, hey, look, 50% of the population didn't vote for them. But as Harper told you, the opposition is still in there holding the government to account, right? And especially when you see the opposition leader cooperating with, government leaders, that tells people that they should buy into the government response. Having government, as opposed to just having an alternative world where you have technocrats and Donald Trump going off on Twitter, is more likely to lead to consensus among the public, among different voter groups, than in your world where you have technocrats that aren't authorized by other people. There are still political
actors spouting their opinions around, but nobody trusts the technocrats who are completely new. A government can create consensus, especially when you get people from the other side of the house adding to their authority. Additionally, powers are just distributed relative to the vote, which is what Harper told you. So even insofar as you're correct, we don't think the public buy-in is as bad as they wanted to say. Secondly, we told you, though, that politicians are charismatic, that they have experience on campaign trails, and they can uniquely communicate ideas to people in a way that scientists can't. The response from the other team was that, hey, look, you know, actually, we hate politicians. They're dirty, self-interested snakes, and we love technocrats because they're not self-interested at all. But like the issue was, we don't think that technocrats can attract the same level of, you know, trust and faith from the population as they wanted to make out without the government backing them, because you don't know them and you don't recognize them. And also, we don't think the technocrats are necessarily good at appearing sympathetic or conveying the problem to the population, because literally a lot of the affirmative case was about how these technocrats couldn't communicate the politician without communicate the issue to a politician without losing clarity. So I'm not sure in what world they have these charismatic, effective, all great technocrats that they wanted to talk about. But also a key part of this wasn't just about the people, it was about stability. It was about recognizing people and understanding that it's still the same country you're in before. Being willing to not go crazy and start rioting because your civil liberties are being taken away, and actually putting up with that response in the meantime, because you know it's the government that you should trust, you should listen to. We thought that that was something unique to our side that you don't get when you have a completely new government. And even though Mitch tried to reframe it in a split point, we think the harms of that are far worse. Also, as Harper flagged, if technocrats fail, the public backlash will be far, far worse, because these are people who are seen as an authority. And if you can't trust them, there are huge amounts of confusion and people have no clue what to do. Winning this point was crucial, especially due to the current nature of the crisis we're in right now, where public buy-in is just as important part of policies working as the policies themselves. And given that we've proved a significantly better response on our side of the house, we think we've won that point. Secondly, though, about the quality of decisions, because we told you that on our side of the house, the government can still be advised by experts, and that's just as good. You know, the affirmative team claimed that politicians can and never be experts, but the only reason we heard why you needed to be an expert in the first place was because you lose clarity. That just contradicted the whole characterization that ministers aren't involved in the policy-making process anyways, right? Because what we were left with at the end of this debate was a world in which policies are written by experts, and that can coexist in a world where government signs off on the bills and ensures they meet voter criteria. We don't understand why they had to make it one or the other on their side of the house. But also talking about the efficiency of decision-making and trade-offs. We told you democracies were better, not just because the politicians were experienced, but because the democracy itself has set systems, especially in times of crises, for making decisions, right? So when the affirmative team tried to say, oh, look, parliamentary debate sucks, there are specific guidelines in a crisis or a state of emergency that help the government make efficient decisions. The issue with the World Health Organization was that they were untested, they were an untested bureaucratic structure, and they floundered when it came to deciding whether or not to declare a pandemic now or to wait until it reached the official number stage. The issue wasn't that they were, a bureaucratic organization in the first place. It's that they had no experience. It is having those government systems in place, having them tried and tested, that allows efficient, quick decision making.
On that.
Also, just the idea that technocrats all agree and that, fixes the problem, that's clearly not true. Our case was that when you have technocrats from lots of different areas, they all have different ideas of what is absolutely correct, because it's not like you can come to a consensus. It's not like the trade-off's incredibly easy, right? For a like viral disease expert, the correct solution is for everybody to stay at home. And for a public behavior expert, the correct solution is for people to stay at home for a month, have a week off, and stay at home for another month. And for economists, they want people to live relatively freely, as what's happening in Sweden right now. And the thing is, they will never be able to reach an agreement as quickly as politicians who have structures, who have pre-negotiated concessions will be able to. And also just the idea that they can put dollar values to lives and therefore efficiently weigh up things is terrible, because it concedes the idea that technocrats just think of humans as dollar values and they can't actually weigh up the obligation to voters and preserving public safety and lives efficiently or in a way that is remotely human. We thought that was a terrible argument from the other team. End of this debate, end of the point, you probably had very, very similar policies being passed on either side of the house, right? But the crucial difference is, in the previous point, we told you why people were more likely to buy into them. Final point about accountability, and even if you don't get perfect decision making, why the accountability on a government will be far, far better than on a technocracy. Melissa gave you two excellent mechanisms. Firstly, about how they can be rolled by their own party at the current moment. And secondly, about how in the next election, they can be voted out. Trump's definitely going to get booted. What did we hear? Well, this applies to the technocracy too, right? Look at our model. But the issue was, once the technocrats are out of government, they're never going to go back, right? So having a post-technocracy crisis review isn't going to have a significant effect on their decision-making in that moment, right? And crucially, the issue was you can't get rid of individual people who may be appointed incorrectly without a governmental structure that holds them to account within their party. Like, we thought on our side of the house, people bought into government policies, which is just as good, if not better, as the ones that the affirmative team came up with.
Amazing, thank you, Grace. Can I please ask, is Harper delivering the reply?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool, so I'll invite Harper to give the reply for the NEG.
Where we won this debate was the point where F didn't want to engage in any of our material regarding buy-in. We tell you that responding to a crisis requires public support, and a technocrat spouting scientific jargon just cannot generate the same levels of public support that we tell you we can generate on our side of the house. I have two areas of clash that broadly resemble the burdens that we told you at the start of the debate. Firstly, on the quality of the response. Secondly, on public buy-in. So if we firstly look at the quality of the response, we tell you that the broad brushstrokes of the response are likely to be very similar on both sides of the house because technocrats do advise on both sides of the house. What was the pushback that we heard from the affirmative team? They told us that politicians might ignore this advice. We told you why this is unlikely in the majority of cases due to accountability mechanisms that exist. We think that in this case, they are less likely going to be affected by the short-term incentives of voters that we wanted to tell you about, and more likely to be affected by the relative comparisons to other governments that we told you about, because everyone's experiencing a crisis and because we are looking to different countries to compare ourselves to. So they're probably Jacinda Ardern probably doesn't care about if a few people are upset that we're in lockdown, but she probably does care if we have relatively fewer deaths in another country in terms of her re-election there. So we think even if political incentives do act at this time, we win there. We tell you that we think that they're likely to take on that advice because of voting, but just because of other things, they're probably beholden to the public somewhat. They probably don't want to see the majority of their population die, right? Why is an intermediary response better on our side of the house? We tell you that they can take specific advice from these technocrats and weigh it against other specific advice, whether this is from other technocrats on the exact same issue, whether this is from technocrats in different fields and disciplines, right? Things like an economic response, things like a health response. We tell you that technocrats are clouded by their expertise and that they're biased towards their discipline. We think that Mitch crystallized that when he told us that economists might think of humans as having dollar values on their lives. We tell you we win on this point is that politicians are really adept at weighing this sort of information, at negotiating, at writing this specific policy. This part of crisis management was very seldom addressed by the affirmative team, and we tell you this is a really important part of today's debate because there is a significant difference between knowing how to respond as a technocrat and actually putting those policies into place as a politician. Second point of clash, public buy-in. We tell you that people respond better to politicians they're familiar with, right? And like this whole 50% of people didn't vote for them. We tell you like where there's majority buy-in, and even where you didn't vote for like the government, we tell you you're like in most cases you're likely to be moderate, like New Zealand, you're likely to be accepting of this information, you're likely to be trusting that the party that you did vote for is holding the government to account. For example, National and the Select Business Committee. We tell you like the examples they're relying on us to prove us wrong here. For example, the United States like aren't going to be good on their side either. They never applied their comparative to the examples they wanted to hold us up on, because realistically, when technocrats are thrust into the United States, all of the Republicans in the United States are likely to push back on their policies of like random technocrats in their ivory tower that they didn't choose and they want Trump and that sort of stuff. So the exact same lack of buy-in exists on their side of the house in the very worst case examples. Like we think that on the moderate examples, most cases where we win. We were the team that acknowledged that there are a spectrum of different democratic governments in this debate. We told you that in the majority of cases, governments exist in a moderate environment like New Zealand, or where they don't, they exist in a place where they aren't moderate, but they have significant public buy-in, like India, for example. So most people are likely to be like responsive to the government, are likely to buy into the government. And we think that the governments that don't fall into either category in today's debate, places like the United States, are unlikely to have a good response on either side of the house. So we don't think that any of their pushbacks about technocrats win there. At the end of this debate, we win.
Thank you, Harper. I'll invite William to deliver the final reply. Are you doing that well? Or is it Mitch?
No, it's me. Although I'm sure Mitch would love to. It's getting very heated on the team group chat. We'll admit, we did make a mistake in today's debate. We let the debate be focused too much about New Zealand, probably the least helpful example for our side. Because if you take one look outside our borders at ScoMo, at Boris Johnson, at Trump, you realize that most of the material made by the negating team just falls flat because people do hate their leaders and people do listen to people that like have more technical like background than them. And besides new material at Reply about Republicans getting angry at technocrats, they had no response to the broader global context of this debate. 3 points of clash. Firstly, on effective crisis management, secondly, on public buy-in, and thirdly, on accountability, especially post-crisis. Let's talk about crisis management, because we were quite clear. We gave you 4 reasons why you get more effective policy. Because politicians are focused on elections, because they have other interests like business interests, because things get lost in translation, and because like things are generally slower, and we explained why. And this is important, right? Because time is lives saved, right? Minor differences in policy are very important in how the crisis unfolds. What did they say in response to this? Well, first they said that technocrats were partisan, which was like blatantly wrong, right? Technocrats like are in the same career over successive governments. And then at Grace, they said, well, we have systems in place that help deal with it. So New Zealand like did its alert level, and that's fine. But we don't really think they listened to our model here, right? Because we told you that we'd have committees of these technocrats that can make these decisions, right? So you get all that sort of like cross like knowledge interaction, which they seem to think we wouldn't get. And then they had like a new thing at Reply where they said, well, Jacinda will copy other governments instead of like listen to her voters. And we just think that's been broadly unsubstantiated throughout the debate. At the end of this point, Melissa dismissed this as less important because there'd be less similar policies. We think maybe that's true in New Zealand, but when we think broadly in the global context, where governments aren't managing these crises well, we think it's important that the policies are better than they currently are. Secondly, let's talk about public buy-in, because the broad thrust of the negating case was that, well, people trust Jacinda, they voted for her. We gave you a number of responses. Firstly, we told you that many people didn't vote for them and are instantly opposed to anything they say. Secondly, that they never explained why technocrats wouldn't be trusted. Like they said, Ashley Bloomfield wouldn't be trusted because we didn't know him, but like they never said why that was the case. Thirdly, we told you about science communicators. And Grace said in response to that, well, like Bloomfield's trust comes from some like vision of cooperation from the government, but she didn't explain like why that was the case, and like definitely didn't engage with any of our mechanisms as why people are more likely to trust someone who has like expert knowledge and they know isn't partisan and they know wouldn't lie to them. Even if this wasn't the case, like other countries exist, right? A distrust in the US doesn't come from technocrats. It comes from partisan party politics, right? And that you only get more of when you believe negating side of the house. Let's talk about accountability, especially in post-crisis, because they told us that, well, like the opposition will keep the government accountable or they'll get rolled, but like the opposition presumably will only keep them accountable in politically viable ways. So Simon Bridges, as we told you, would go out and be like, oh, they're making us be locked down for too long. And like, yes, that's accountable, but it's not like, it's not helpful policy. Then they said, and Grace, I think, they said, well, they'll be accountable at the election, right? Trump will be booted out in the next election because people weren't happy, right? That's just not going to happen, right? We think Trump is probably going to end up winning in a landslide again because like he makes politically astute decisions, like we explained right back at first F, which means he's not prioritizing policy and he wants to get elected, which means he's not being accountable. Then we heard new material about Grace about like how if the technocrats fail, they'll get like even deeper mistrust. But we implicitly solved this in our model when we talked about like how they can be inquired into post-crisis. Importantly, they completely ignored Mitch's split about the abuse of power post-crisis, which got no response to. At the end of today's debate, we were the only side of the House that actually grappled with the reality of crises across the world, where governments are just not good enough. It may be one thing to live in New Zealand, where we have a like pretty competent government, but for most people in most important places worldwide, a firming team definitely wins today's debate.
Thank you, Will. I guess we will all be leaving this Zoom or staying on the Zoom to announce the result.
We will be leaving this soon.
We will be leaving this Zoom. Cool. So yes, we'll be back in 10.
Wonderful.
Guys. Are you going to